There's a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical effort. You sit down to work. You open the document, the spreadsheet, the book you've been meaning to finish. And within 90 seconds, you are somewhere else. A notification, a half-formed worry about dinner, a memory of something someone said last week that you're only now deciding to be annoyed about. You look up an hour later, and the page is still blank, or the paragraph you wrote is the same paragraph you started with, and you feel a specific kind of shame that doesn't have a good name. Not laziness exactly, something closer to helplessness, as if your own mind has become a room you can no longer lock the door to. This is not a personal failing. It is the defining psychological struggle of this era, and it is engineered, in large part, by systems designed with extraordinary sophistication to fragment your attention, because your attention is the product being sold. But it is also, underneath the technology, an old and human problem, one that monks and philosophers and soldiers and parents have wrestled with for as long as there have been things worth paying attention to and things pulling us away from them. This is a book about focus, not as a productivity hack, not as a matter of discipline you either have or don't, but as a skill. A trainable, buildable, occasionally fragile skill that responds to structure, to environment, to emotional state, and to a clearer understanding of what your attention actually is and how it actually breaks. We'll follow 4 people through this. Amara, a surgeon who discovers that the multitasking she was praised for in medical school has been quietly costing her more than she realized. Julian, a novelist whose apartment has become a minefield of tiny, reasonable-seeming distractions, each one small enough to ignore and cumulatively large enough to end his career. Tobias, a teenager navigating the most attention-hostile environment ever built for a developing brain, and the strange bargain he strikes with his own phone. And Priya, an emergency room nurse who has to learn that sometimes focus isn't found by adding structure, but by working with rather than against the fear that narrows her mind. Each of them will teach us something different about attention, how it's divided, how it's trained, how it's protected, and how it's restored. By the end, the goal isn't for you to become a machine that never wavers. It's for you to understand your own mind well enough to work with it, to build a life and a set of habits where focus is less something you fight for and more something that becomes available to you again and again because you've built the conditions for it to show up. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Myth of Doing 2 Things at Once. Amara had been a surgical resident for 11 months when she started keeping a private list. Not of complications, not of patience, of moments where she caught her own mind somewhere else while her hand were doing something that mattered. Threading a suture while thinking about a text she hadn't answered. Reviewing a chart while half listening to a colleague. Nodding at the right intervals without absorbing a word. She didn't tell anyone about the list. It felt too much like confession. She had always considered herself excellent at multitasking. It was, in fact, one of the qualities that had gotten her through medical school. The ability to field 3 pages at once, chart while walking, eat a granola bar during rounds while mentally rehearsing a differential diagnosis. Her attendings had praised this. Multitasking, in the culture of the hospital, was treated as a form of competence, almost a virtue. The residents who could do 5 things simultaneously were the ones who survived the pace. What Amara hadn't understood yet, what almost no one in that building had been taught to understand, is that the brain does not actually multitask, not in the way we use the word. What it does instead is called task switching, rapidly toggling attention from one thing to another, disengaging from the first task and re-engaging with the second, over and over, sometimes dozens of times a minute. Each switch has a cost. Cognitive psychologists call it a switch cost, and it isn't trivial. Every time you pull your attention away from one task and redirect it to another, there's a measurable lag, a residue of the first task that lingers and interferes with your performance on the second. Researchers have a term for this residue, attention residue. Part of your mind stays behind, working on the thing you just left, even as you try to move forward on something new. This is why answering a single email in the middle of writing a report doesn't cost you 30 seconds. It costs you the 30 seconds of typing, plus several minutes of degraded performance afterward as your brain slowly reorients to the report. plus the mental energy spent managing the transition itself. Multiply that by the 20 or 30 times a day most people switch between tasks. And you start to see why so many people reach the end of a busy day having been productive nonstop and yet accomplished almost nothing that required real thought. Amara's turning point came on a Tuesday that started ordinarily and nearly ended in catastrophe. She was closing a routine procedure, running through the final checks with a nurse, when her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from her sister about their mother, 3 words visible on the lock screen before she looked away, "She's in pain." She kept working. Her hands kept moving. But some fraction of her mind had already left the room and was sitting in a waiting area 3 states away. And in that fraction of distraction, she nearly miscounted a surgical sponge. Nearly. A junior nurse caught it before it became anything. Nothing happened. But Amara stood in the scrub room afterward, hands still slightly shaking, and understood something she'd been avoiding for almost a year. She had built her professional identity around a skill that doesn't exist. Nobody multitasks. People just switch, and switching has a price, and she had been paying that price in patients' bodies without knowing the bill was coming due. What she learned, in the months that followed, working with a hospital psychologist brought in for physician wellness, wasn't to simply concentrate harder. That's not how attention works. And telling someone to concentrate harder is a little like telling someone with a sprained ankle to just walk normally. The advice that actually helped her was structural. She began practicing something researchers call single tasking as a deliberate discipline, not a moral stance, but a practical one. During surgery, her phone stayed in a locker, not a pocket, because she'd learned that even a phone sitting silent and face down in a pocket exerts a measurable pull on attention. Studies on this have found that the mere presence of a phone within reach, even off, even untouched, reduces available cognitive capacity because part of the brain is quietly monitoring for it. Not using it, monitoring it. The vigilance itself is the cost. She also learned to separate categories of work she'd previously blended without thinking. There is a difference between administrative attention, checking boxes, replying to messages, reviewing logistics, and what some call generative attention, the kind of focus required to actually think, diagnose, decide, create. Amara had been treating these as interchangeable, sliding from one into the other all day, and wondering why she felt both busy and intellectually empty by evening. She began batching the administrative work into defined windows and protecting the generative work, the actual thinking, behind hard boundaries. Not because it made her feel virtuous, but because the data on her own performance improved. Fewer near misses, better retention of patient details, a strange, almost unfamiliar sensation at the end of some days, the feeling of having been present for her own work rather than having sprinted through a blur of it. There's a broader lesson in Amara's story that applies far outside operating rooms. Most of us have absorbed, culturally, the idea that doing many things at once is a mark of capability. It is often the opposite. It is frequently a mark of a system, a job, a household, a phone that has fragmented your attention into pieces too small to do anything meaningful with any of them. The first step toward focus is not additional willpower. It's the recognition that switching is not free and that protecting single task time is not indulgent. It's the precondition for doing anything well. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Distraction. Julian's apartment, by any reasonable measure, was a good place to write. Tall windows, a quiet street, a desk he'd bought specifically because it had no drawers to rummage through, and yet he had not finished a chapter in 4 months. He didn't think of himself as undisciplined. He thought of himself, if anything, as someone under siege by 100 small, entirely reasonable interruptions. The neighbor's dog, a text from his editor that seemed urgent and turned out not to be. The particular way his laptop would show a small red notification badge on an icon, and how something in his chest would tighten slightly until he clicked it, even though he already suspected, correctly, almost every time, that it was nothing that mattered. What Julian didn't fully appreciate, until a friend who worked in behavioral design explained it to him over dinner, is that very little of his distraction was really about willpower failing. Most of it was about architecture. Environment. The physical and digital arrangement of his life had been quietly optimized, mostly by other people, mostly for other people's benefit, to minimize the effort required to distract him and maximize the effort required to focus. Consider what psychologists call attentional friction, the amount of effort it takes to start or stop a behavior. Every design choice in Julian's environment had been reducing the friction of distraction and increasing the friction of concentration, usually without his awareness. His phone lived within arm's reach, meaning the physical effort to check it was close to zero. His email client opened automatically when he started his computer, meaning the effort to avoid seeing new messages required an active, ongoing act rather than simple default behavior. Meanwhile, the effort required to begin deep, sustained writing, no interruptions, phone in another room, a specific block of time, required him to constantly resist a dozen small paths of least resistance, all day, every day. Willpower, it turns out, behaves less like a fixed trait and more like a finite resource that depletes with use over the course of a day, a phenomenon researchers have studied under the term ego depletion. And while the research on the exact mechanism remains debated, the everyday experience of it is something almost everyone recognizes. The version of you at 9 in the morning who can ignore a buzzing phone is simply not the same version of you at 4 in the afternoon after 50 small resistances already spent. The friend's advice to Julian was almost embarrassingly simple, and it changed his working life more than anything he'd tried before. Stop trying to out-willpower your environment. Redesign it instead. He moved his phone into a different room during writing hours, not silenced, not face down, but physically absent, because the research on this is unambiguous. Proximity matters independently of whether the device is being used. He removed his email client from auto-launch and set specific windows, twice a day, when he would look at it, rather than letting it run continuously in the background of his mind. He downloaded a browser extension that added a 20-second delay before certain distracting sites would load, not blocking them outright, which he tried and always found a way around, but adding just enough friction that the automatic, thoughtless click became, instead, a moment where he had to actively choose. 20 seconds sounds trivial. In practice, it was often enough. The behaviors we do automatically, without thought, are remarkably sensitive to small amounts of added friction. The behaviors we do deliberately are not nearly as sensitive to the same friction, because we've already decided to do them. He also did the reverse. He decreased the friction around the behavior he wanted more of. He began leaving his manuscript open on his screen at all times, the cursor blinking in the middle of an unfinished sentence, so that sitting down to write required zero setup. No decision, no fresh blank page demanding to be filled, just a sentence already halfway spoken, waiting for him to finish it. Small thing. It worked far better than he expected. There's a concept from behavioral science that Julian's friend introduced him to that reframed the whole problem. The idea that most failures of self-control are actually failures of design, not character. We tend to moralize distraction, treating someone who can't stop checking their phone as weak-willed, and someone who focuses easily as simply disciplined. But increasingly, researchers who study attention argue this framing is mostly wrong. The people who focus well are very often not people with superior willpower. They are people, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design, who have built environments where focus is the path of least resistance and distraction requires effort. This reframing mattered enormously to Julian because it moved the problem from a place of shame into a place of engineering. He stopped asking, late at night, why am I so weak? He started asking, more usefully, what in my environment is making this harder than it needs to be, and what would it look like to change one thing this week? Not a total life overhaul. One thing. Phone in the other room. That was the whole first change. It was enough to notice a difference within days. The deeper truth in Julian's story is one worth sitting with. Attention is not simply an internal faculty you either possess or lack. It exists in constant negotiation with your surroundings. A monk in a monastery built over centuries specifically to support contemplation will find stillness more easily than someone equally devoted sitting in a room with 6 notification-generating devices. Not because the monk has a stronger mind, but because the monk is not fighting his environment for every minute of attention. Most modern environments, homes, offices, phones, have been arranged, often unintentionally and sometimes very intentionally, to work against sustained focus. The work of reclaiming attention starts not with gritting your teeth, but with looking honestly at your surroundings and asking what they are actually optimized for. Chapter 3. The Dopamine Loop. Tobias was 16, and he could not remember the last time he had read more than 2 pages of anything without checking his phone. This wasn't unique to him. His friends are the same, his cousins, most of the people in his classes, but it bothered him more than he let on, because he had a project due, a research paper on a topic he actually found interesting, and every time he sat down to read the source material, his hand moved to his phone before his conscious mind had even registered the decision. He'd look up 10 minutes later, having watched 4 short videos he couldn't fully remember, with no idea how he'd gotten there. What was happening to Tobias has a name, and understanding the mechanism doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does explain why just don't check your phone is such spectacularly bad advice for something operating on this level. The brain's dopamine system evolved to help humans seek out things that were good for survival: food, social connection, novel information that might signal danger or opportunity. Dopamine isn't primarily a pleasure chemical, as it's often described. It's more accurately a chemical of anticipation and seeking. It spikes not when you get the reward, but in the moments leading up to it. The uncertainty, the possibility. This is precisely why slot machines are so effective, and it is precisely the mechanism that modern apps are built around, often quite deliberately, by teams of people whose job is explicitly to maximize the time users spend engaged. A feed that refreshes with new, unpredictable content every time you pull down on it is functioning, neurologically, almost identically to a slot machine. The unpredictability is the point. If the reward were guaranteed and constant, the pull would be much weaker. It's the variable ratio, sometimes something interesting, sometimes nothing, that makes the checking compulsive rather than occasional. Tobias's brain, still developing, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and long-term planning, doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s, was being asked to resist a system engineered by adults with decades of behavioral research at their disposal, adults whose company's revenue depended directly on his continued engagement. This isn't a fair fight, and framing it as a simple matter of Tobias needing more self-discipline badly misunderstands what he was actually up against. What helped Tobias wasn't a single dramatic intervention, not deleting every app, not a total digital detox, both of which he'd tried and abandoned within days. What helped was smaller and more sustainable, understanding the loop well enough to interrupt it at its weakest point. The loop has a structure: a cue, boredom, a lull, a notification, a routine, picking up the phone, opening the app, and a reward: novelty, social validation, distraction from discomfort. Tobias's school counselor, who ran a small group on attention and technology, walked the students through this structure and asked them to identify their own specific cues, not phones in general, but the precise moments the pull was strongest. For Tobias, it was almost always the transition moments, finishing one task and not yet having started the next, that few seconds of directionlessness. That gap was where his hand moved before his mind caught up. Once he could name the cue, he could design around it rather than fighting it in the moment, which almost never worked because by the time he noticed he was reaching for the phone, the routine was already halfway executed. Instead, he built a small ritual for those transition moments. Before switching from one task to the next, he'd stand up and do it a specific way. Refill his water, look out the window for 10 breaths. It sounds almost too small to matter, but it filled the exact gap where the old cue used to trigger the old routine and gave his restless attention somewhere to go that wasn't the phone. He also learned something that reframed his own self-criticism. The goal was never going to be zero use, and treating it as a moral failing every time he slipped only made him feel worse, which, this is important, actually made him more likely to seek the comfort of the app afterward, not less. Shame is a poor motivator for behavior change. It tends to trigger the very avoidance and comfort-seeking it's meant to prevent. The more effective frame, his counselor suggested, was curiosity rather than judgment, noticing the pull without immediately following it, and without punishing himself when he did follow it. "Oh, there's the urge again," is a very different internal sentence than "what is wrong with me." There's a wider point in Tobias's story about designed environments versus willpower, similar in spirit to Julian's, but distinct in its mechanism. Where Julian's problem was largely about friction, how easy or hard something was to do, Tobias's problem was more directly about reward architecture, the way uncertain, variable rewards hijack a seeking system that evolved for a very different world. Both point to the same conclusion, though. Focus is rarely a pure test of character. It is very often a contest between an individual mind and a system, digital or physical, engineered by other people to win that contest. Recognizing the engineering doesn't make you immune to it, but it does mean you can start designing countermeasures instead of simply blaming yourself every time the system wins a round. Chapter 4. The State Beneath the Struggle. Priya had read about flow before she ever experienced it. The term coined by the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi to describe a state of complete absorption in an activity, where self-consciousness falls away, time distorts, and action and awareness seem to merge into a single continuous thread. She'd read the description and thought it sounded a little mystical, a little overstated. Then, one Thursday, restocking a supply cart during a rare, quiet stretch on the ward, she looked up and 40 minutes had passed that felt like 5, and she understood the description hadn't been overstated at all. It had just been describing something she'd never had language for. What interested Priya once she started paying attention to it wasn't just that flow felt good, though it did more than almost anything else in her work, but that it seemed to follow rules. It wasn't random. It showed up under specific conditions and vanished under others. And once she noticed the pattern, she began, almost like a researcher studying her own mind, to map it. The condition researchers point to most consistently is the relationship between challenge and skill. Flow tends to emerge in a narrow band where the difficulty of a task closely matches a person's current ability. Not so easy that the mind wanders in search of stimulation. Not so hard that anxiety crowds out absorption. Too far in one direction and you get boredom. Too far in the other and you get overwhelmed. The state lives in between, and it's genuinely narrow, which is part of why it can feel elusive, arriving unpredictably during some tasks and never during others that look similar from the outside. Priya noticed this band directly in her own work. Routine tasks, restocking supplies, basic charting, rarely produce flow. They were too far below her skill level to fully absorb her attention, and her mind would wander to other things while her hands worked. But the tasks that demanded her full clinical judgment without exceeding it, a complex but manageable patient situation, one that called on everything she knew but didn't outstrip it. Those were the moments the 40 minutes disappeared. Not the highest stakes, most terrifying cases. Those produced something closer to narrowed, anxious hyperfocus, useful for the tunnel vision the moment demanded, but not the same expansive, absorbed state at all. It was the demanding but manageable middle where flow consistently appeared. The second condition, closely related, is clear and immediate feedback, knowing in real time whether what you're doing is working. This is part of why so many flow-inducing activities, from music to sports to surgery to certain kinds of skilled craft work, involve constant, moment-to-moment feedback about performance. Ambiguous, delayed feedback, the kind common in a lot of modern knowledge work, where you might not know if a project succeeded for months, tends to work against flow because part of the absorption comes from the tight loop between action and result. The third condition is a clear goal, not a vague sense of doing a good job, but a specific, well-defined target for the next stretch of time. Priya noticed that her flow states almost always coincided with unambiguous immediate goals. Stabilize this patient, complete this procedure, get through this specific task. When her goals were fuzzy, a slow afternoon with a general sense that she should be productive, her attention scattered instead of gathering. What Priya eventually built, once she understood these conditions, wasn't a way to force flow. Researchers are fairly clear that flow can't be summoned directly, only invited by arranging the right conditions, and then, paradoxically, not trying too hard to control the outcome. What she built was a habit of noticing before starting a task, whether the conditions were even plausible. Was the challenge roughly matched to her skill for this particular stretch of work? Could she define a clear, specific goal for the next block of time rather than a vague intention? Was there a way to get faster feedback on whether she was on track? For tasks that didn't naturally have these conditions, administrative work, paperwork, the unglamorous parts of any job, she learned to artificially construct them rather than assuming flow simply wasn't available there. She'd set a specific, almost game-like goal. Finish this exact set of charts in the next 25 minutes. She'd track her own pace as a form of feedback, checking in every few minutes against that self-imposed deadline. It wasn't true flow, not the effortless absorption of her best clinical moments, but it was close enough to meaningfully change how the work felt, from a shapeless slog into something with edges and momentum. There's an important caution in Priya's story, too, because flow has become something of a buzzword, marketed almost as a productivity cheat code, and that framing misses something essential about it. Flow is not a state you can access on command for 8 hours a day. It's demanding, even as it feels effortless in the moment. Genuinely absorbing tasks draw on real cognitive and, in physically demanding work, physical resources, and most people can only sustain a few hours of it before needing real recovery. The people who chase flow constantly, try to optimize every waking hour into peak absorption, often burn out faster than people who accept that most work, most of the time, will be effortful, moderately engaging, and occasionally tedious, with flow arriving as a welcome visitor rather than a permanent resident. Understanding the conditions that invite it is valuable. Expecting to live inside it constantly is a recipe for disappointment, and for the kind of exhaustion that erodes focus rather than protecting it. Chapter 5. The Fatigue Nobody Warns You About. Amara, 6 months after her near miss in the operating room, had made real changes: the phone in the locker, the batched administrative work, the protected blocks for actual thinking. And yet there were still afternoons where her focus simply evaporated, no matter how well she'd structured her environment. It took her longer than it should have to understand that this wasn't a design failure. It was fatigue, and fatigue behaves according to its own rules, largely indifferent to how well organized your calendar is. Attention, it turns out, is not a switch that's either on or off. It's closer to a resource that depletes with sustained use and needs specific kinds of replenishment. And critically, not all rest replenishes it equally. Scrolling a phone during a break, which is what almost everyone reaches for, often fails to restore attentional capacity precisely because it engages the same systems: rapid visual processing, constant novel stimuli, frequent task switching, that got depleted in the first place. It feels like rest because it's passive and undemanding in one sense, but from the perspective of sustained, directed attention, it can be closer to more of the same. The research on what actually does restore attention points somewhere less obvious. What's sometimes called attention restoration theory, developed by psychologists Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, distinguishes between directed attention, the effortful, voluntary focus required for demanding work, which fatigues with use, and what they term involuntary or soft fascination, the effortless, gentle engagement of attention that occurs in certain low-demand environments, classically natural ones. A walk without a destination, time spent looking at clouds or moving water, anything that holds attention lightly without requiring effortful direction. This kind of exposure appears to allow directed attention to recover in a way that screen-based breaks generally do not. Amara tested this almost by accident. On a particularly draining week, unable to face her phone during a break, she instead walked to a small park near the hospital and sat for 15 minutes without any device, watching a fountain, not deliberately meditating, just present. She returned to her shift and noticed, distinctly, that her concentration for the remainder of the day was sharper than on days she'd spent her breaks scrolling. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was a subtle, consistent difference, but consistent enough over several weeks that she began protecting those 15 minutes deliberately, treating them with something close to the seriousness she gave her protected thinking blocks. She also had to confront something harder: sleep. It's almost a cliche at this point to say sleep matters. Repeated so often it's become easy to dismiss, but the specific mechanism matters more than the platitude. Sleep deprivation doesn't just make people tired in a general sense. It specifically and disproportionately degrades the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for sustained attention, impulse control, and the ability to resist distraction. A sleep-deprived brain doesn't lose all cognitive function evenly. It loses executive function first and worst, which means the exact faculties required for focus are the first casualties of a bad night's sleep, even when a person still feels alert enough to function in other ways. Amara, working rotating shifts that fragmented her sleep for years, had simply accepted degraded focus as a permanent baseline, an unavoidable cost of her profession. Once she understood the mechanism, she couldn't always fix the schedule. Hospitals don't rearrange themselves for one resident. But she could stop mistaking chronic sleep debt for a personal failure of discipline, and she could protect what sleep windows she did have with far more seriousness than she previously had, rather than sacrificing them to the last few minutes of a show or a scroll through her phone before bed. The lesson embedded in Amara's fatigue, and one that's easy to miss in a culture that treats focus almost entirely as a matter of technique and willpower, is that attention has a physiological floor. No amount of clever environmental design, no app blocker, no elegant task batching system will produce sustained focus from a brain that is chronically sleep-deprived or has had no real recovery from directed attention in weeks. The people who focus most reliably over long periods are very often not the people with the most sophisticated productivity systems. They're the people who've taken the biological substrate of attention seriously, protecting sleep, building in genuine rest rather than substitute rest, and accepting that focus, like any physical capacity, has limits that discipline alone cannot override. Chapter 6. Why some things are easy to focus on. Julian, several months into his environmental redesign, noticed something that puzzled him. The changes had helped enormously: fewer interruptions, easier starts, but there was still a strange asymmetry in his focus. He could sit for 3 uninterrupted hours on a chapter he was excited about and barely notice the time. The same environment, the same removed distractions, produced almost immediate restlessness when he sat down to work on a ghostwriting project he'd taken for money, one he found genuinely tedious. The friction reduction he'd engineered helped both cases somewhat, but it didn't erase the gap between them, and he wanted to understand why. The answer had less to do with environment and more to do with motivation, specifically the difference between what psychologists call intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is engagement in an activity for its own sake, because it's interesting, meaningful, or satisfying in itself. Extrinsic motivation is engagement for some separate outcome: money, approval, avoiding punishment. Both can produce effort, but they don't produce the same quality of attention, and they don't hold up the same way under difficulty. Research associated with self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, identifies 3 conditions that tend to strengthen intrinsic motivation and, by extension, the kind of focus that requires less external enforcement. Autonomy, the sense of choosing and controlling one's own actions. Competence, the sense of being effective and capable at the task. And relatedness, a sense of connection to other people or to something beyond the immediate task. When these 3 conditions are present, sustained attention tends to feel less like effort and more like natural absorption. When they're absent, when a task feels imposed, when someone feels incompetent at it, when it feels disconnected from anything they care about, focus becomes a constant uphill push, requiring far more willpower per minute of concentration. Julian's novel offered him all 3. He'd chosen the project himself. He'd been writing long enough to feel genuinely skilled at it, at least most days, and it connected to something he cared about, an idea he'd wanted to explore for years, characters he'd grown attached to. The ghostwriting project offered him almost none of these. It had been assigned rather than chosen. The subject matter was outside his areas of confidence, and it connected to nothing beyond a paycheck. No environmental redesign was going to fully close that gap because the problem wasn't friction. It was motivational architecture. This didn't mean Julian could simply abandon the paying work in favor of only what inspired him. That's not a realistic option for most people, in most jobs, most of the time. But understanding the mechanism let him make smaller, more targeted adjustments. He couldn't manufacture genuine passion for the ghostwriting subject matter, but he could increase his sense of autonomy within it, choosing his own structure and process for how he approached the chapters, even when the subject was fixed. He could work deliberately on competence, researching the unfamiliar subject matter until it felt less foreign and more within his grasp, which measurably reduced the resistance he felt sitting down to it. And he found a version of relatedness by reminding himself, more concretely than he had been, of the actual person the project was for and what it meant to them, reconnecting an abstract, disliked task to a specific human consequence he did care about. None of this transformed the ghostwriting project into something he loved, but it closed enough of the gap that he stopped needing to white-knuckle his way through every session. And that mattered because willpower spent forcing focus onto poorly motivated work is willpower unavailable later for everything else in a day. There's a broader implication in Julian's discovery that's easy to overlook in most conversations about focus, which tend to treat all attention problems as environmental or technical. Sometimes the reason a task is hard to focus on isn't distraction at all. It's that the task itself has been stripped of autonomy, competence, or connection, and no phone blocking app is going to fix a motivational problem. Before assuming a focus issue is about discipline or distraction, it's worth asking a more basic question. Does this task, as currently structured, give me any reason beyond obligation to want to be here? Sometimes the answer reveals that the real fix isn't a better system. It's a different relationship to the work itself. Chapter 7, Training the Muscle. Tobias, a year after his counselor's group, had made real progress with the transition moment ritual and the reframing of shame into curiosity. But he noticed something else worth understanding. His attention span, even outside of phone-related distraction, seemed shorter than it used to be. Reading a printed book, no phone involved at all, was harder than he remembered it being a few years earlier. He wondered if this was permanent, if something had actually changed in his brain that couldn't be undone. The honest answer, based on what's currently understood about attention and neuroplasticity, is nuanced. The brain's capacity for sustained attention does appear responsive to habitual patterns of use. The brain adapts to the demands placed on it, a principle sometimes summarized as neurons that fire together wire together. Environments that constantly train rapid switching between short bursts of stimulation may, over time, make sustained, single-pointed attention feel less natural and more effortful, simply because it's a pattern being exercised less often. This isn't fully settled science, and it's easy to overstate. Human attention has always had limits, and claims of an unprecedented modern attention crisis sometimes exceed what the research firmly supports. But the underlying principle, that attention, like most cognitive and physical capacities, responds to training, is well established, and it points toward good news alongside the concerning part. If sustained attention can be weakened by disuse, it can also be strengthened by deliberate practice. The clearest evidence for trainability comes from research on meditation, particularly attention-focused practices like breath-based mindfulness meditation. Studies using both behavioral measures and brain imaging have found that sustained meditation practice is associated with improved performance on tasks requiring sustained attention, and with structural and functional changes in brain regions associated with attentional control. The mechanism makes intuitive sense once you understand what the practice actually asks of you. Sitting with attention on the breath, noticing when the mind has wandered, which it will constantly. This is expected and not a sign of failure, and gently redirecting attention back, over and over. That redirection is the exercise. It's less like sitting still and more like a repeated bicep curl for a specific attentional muscle. Notice wandering, redirect, notice wandering, redirect. Tobias started small, 5 minutes a day, using a simple timer rather than an app, deliberately choosing not to introduce another screen into the one part of his day meant to counteract screen-driven habits. He didn't find it pleasant, particularly at first. His mind wandered constantly, and he initially interpreted this as proof he was bad at it, until his counselor pointed out that noticing the wandering and gently returning is the entire practice. There's no version of meditation where the mind doesn't wander. The wandering isn't a bug in the process. It's the repetition that builds the skill. Alongside meditation, Tobias experimented with something simpler, deliberately choosing for one block of time a day an activity requiring sustained attention with no built-in stopping points, a printed book, a puzzle, an instrument he was learning, and committing to staying with it even through the restlessness that showed up early on. He noticed a pattern. The urge to check his phone or switch tasks tended to peak around 8 to 10 minutes into the activity, and if he could ride out that peak without giving in, the restlessness usually settled, and the remaining time became genuinely easier. This matches something researchers have observed more broadly, that cravings and urges, whether for a phone check or any other habitual behavior, tend to follow a wave-like pattern, rising, peaking, and then subsiding on their own if not acted upon, typically within a matter of minutes. Knowing this in advance changed how Tobias experienced the discomfort. Instead of interpreting the urge as a signal that something had gone wrong, he began treating it as a known, temporary wave he'd already learned how to ride. Over several months, without any single dramatic change, Tobias noticed his baseline shifting. Reading sessions that used to feel impossible past 10 minutes stretched to 20, then 40. This didn't happen because he became a fundamentally different person. It happened because attention, like most trainable capacities, responds to consistent, moderate, repeated practice far more reliably than it responds to intense, occasional effort. A few minutes most days did more for him than the all-or-nothing digital detoxes he'd attempted and abandoned before. The lesson in Tobias's story is one of the more genuinely hopeful ideas in the psychology of attention. Focus is not simply a fixed trait you either have or lack, inherited and immutable. It behaves in important ways like a skill, responsive to practice, capable of being strengthened through deliberate, repeated exercise, even after periods of erosion. This doesn't mean the environmental and motivational factors covered in earlier chapters stop mattering. They remain the foundation. But layered on top of a well-designed environment and well-matched motivation, direct training of the attentional system through meditation or simply through repeated, deliberate practice of sustained, single-pointed activity appears to offer real, measurable strengthening over time. Chapter 8. Focus Under Fire. Priya's hardest lesson about attention came not from a slow shift where flow arrived easily, but from the opposite, a night in the emergency department that tested everything she thought she understood about focus and taught her something the earlier, calmer lessons hadn't covered. A multi-vehicle accident brought in 5 patients within 20 minutes, overwhelming a department already stretched thin. Priya felt her attention do something she recognized from her training but had never fully understood until she was inside it. It narrowed, sharply and involuntarily, zeroing in on immediate, concrete tasks, vitals, airway, bleeding, while peripheral awareness, planning, and anything not immediately in front of her essentially vanished. She moved fast and competently through the acute tasks. But afterward, reviewing the night with a senior colleague, she realized she'd made a small documentation error and had briefly lost track of a family member's question entirely, something that under calmer circumstances she'd never have missed. What Priya was experiencing has a well-documented basis in stress physiology. Under acute stress, the body's threat response systems, mediated substantially by the amygdala and by stress hormones, including cortisol and adrenaline, trigger changes that prioritize fast, narrow, reactive processing over the slower, broader, more flexible processing associated with the prefrontal cortex. This is sometimes described as attentional narrowing or tunnel vision under stress, and it's not a malfunction. It's an ancient and generally adaptive response, extremely useful for the kind of immediate physical threats it evolved to handle. a response that sharpens focus on the single most urgent input while sacrificing peripheral awareness, complex planning, and working memory capacity. The trouble is that this response, calibrated for physical danger, doesn't distinguish well between a genuine acute emergency and the chronic, lower-grade stress of modern life. A looming deadline, a difficult conversation, general anxiety about the state of things. Mild to moderate stress can actually sharpen focus somewhat, narrowing attention productively onto a task in a way that briefly outperforms a completely relaxed state. This is sometimes described by the Yerkes-Dodson law, which describes an inverted U relationship between arousal and performance. Too little stress, and performance suffers from lack of engagement. Too much, and performance collapses under the narrowing and impairment stress produces. Performance peaks somewhere in the moderate, middle, but push past a certain threshold, and the same narrowing that can sharpen focus in a genuine crisis starts actively degrading the kind of broad, flexible thinking most complex modern work requires. Working memory shrinks, cognitive flexibility drops, and the capacity to hold multiple considerations in mind simultaneously deteriorates. What Priya had to learn wasn't how to eliminate this response. That's not really possible. And in a genuine crisis, she didn't want to eliminate it. The acute narrowing served her and her patients well that night. What she needed was the ability to recognize which mode she was in and adjust accordingly, and to actively downshift the stress response once the acute emergency had passed, rather than letting a residual, activated state bleed into the calmer work that followed. She learned specific techniques for this, largely centered on the body rather than the mind directly, because trying to think her way out of a physiological stress response rarely worked well in the moment. Slow, extended exhales, longer than the inhale, activate the parasympathetic nervous system and can measurably lower physiological arousal within minutes. This is why techniques like box breathing, used widely in high-stress professions from emergency medicine to military and tactical training, focus so heavily on controlling the exhale. Priya began using a version of this deliberately in the minutes after an acute event, before moving into documentation or family conversations that required broader, calmer attention, not as a mystical practice, but as a physiological reset, giving her nervous system a clear signal that the acute threat phase had ended and it was safe to widen back out. She also learned to recognize her own early markers of excessive narrowing before they caused real problems. A specific tightness in her chest, a tendency to snap at colleagues over minor things, a sense of tunnel vision extending to conversations that had nothing to do with the original emergency. Noticing these markers early gave her a chance to intervene, a few breaths, a brief pause before moving to the next task, rather than discovering the narrowing only after a mistake had already been made. The broader lesson from Priya's night is one that's easy to miss in discussions of focus that assume a calm, controlled environment as the default backdrop. Real focus doesn't only need to be built and protected in quiet conditions. It needs to be managed under pressure, with a body's own stress response, however well-intentioned, can work against exactly the kind of flexible, broad attention that complicated situations often require. Understanding this distinction, knowing when narrowed, reactive focus is genuinely serving you, and when it has overstayed its usefulness and needs to be deliberately widened back out, turns out to be its own distinct and valuable skill, separate from anything covered in the earlier, calmer chapters of this book. Conclusion: building a practice, not a personality. Amara, Julian, Tobias, and Priya never met each other. Their struggles took place in an operating room, an apartment, a bedroom, and an emergency department, decades and disciplines apart from one another. But laid side by side, their stories sketch something like a complete picture of what focus actually requires, a picture considerably more layered than the common cultural story, which tends to reduce the whole subject to a single, moralized idea. Some people have discipline, and some people don't. What actually emerges, once you look closely, is that focus depends on several distinct and mostly independent factors, each of which can be strengthened somewhat separately from the others. There's the basic understanding that multitasking, in the way we casually use the term, largely doesn't exist, that switching between tasks carries a real cognitive cost, and that protecting blocks of single-task attention is a precondition for real thinking, not an indulgence. There's environmental design, the recognition that much of what looks like a willpower failure is actually a friction problem, solvable by making distraction slightly harder and focus slightly easier, rather than by trying to out-discipline a phone engineered by teams of specialists to be irresistible. There's an understanding of the dopamine-driven reward loops that make certain modern technologies so specifically compulsive, and the value of interrupting those loops at their weakest point, the cue, rather than relying on willpower once the routine is already underway. There's the narrow, specific set of conditions, matched challenge and skill, clear goals, fast feedback, that invite flow, alongside the caution that flow is a visitor, not a permanent state to be forced or expected constantly. There's the physiological floor beneath all of it, sleep, and genuine restorative rest, distinct from the passive but unrestful scroll most people default to, without which no amount of clever technique will produce reliable focus. There's the motivational architecture of a task itself, autonomy, competence, and connection, which often explains why some efforts feel effortless and others feel like a constant uphill push, regardless of environment. There's the evidence that sustained attention, like most cognitive capacities, is trainable through consistent, moderate, repeated practice, meditation being one of the better studied paths, but not the only one. And there's the recognition that focus under acute stress operates by different rules altogether, narrowing productively in genuine emergencies and needing deliberate, physiological downshifting once the emergency has passed. None of these factors, alone, produces reliable focus. A perfectly designed, distraction-free environment won't help much if you're chronically sleep-deprived. Perfect motivation won't overcome an unaddressed dopamine loop pulling at your attention every few minutes. Understanding flow states doesn't help with the specific, different problem of managing attention under acute pressure. Real, durable focus comes from attending to all of these dimensions together, unevenly, over time. Noticing which factor is currently the weakest link in your own life and addressing that one first, rather than assuming a single technique or app or morning routine will resolve something with this many interacting parts. There's a final idea worth sitting with, one that threads through all four stories, even though none of the characters would have phrased it quite this way. Focus is not a fixed trait that some people are simply born with and others are permanently denied. It is closer to a practice, something built, lost, rebuilt, and refined continually, responsive to sleep, to design, to motivation, to training, to stress, and to the ordinary unpredictability of a human life. The goal was never to become a person who never gets distracted. That person doesn't exist, and chasing that standard mostly produces shame rather than progress. The more realistic and, in the end, more useful goal is to become someone who understands their own attention well enough to notice when it's slipping and why, and to have a reasonably clear sense of what to adjust: the environment, the rest, the motivation, the practice, the stress response, rather than reaching every time for the same blunt and largely unhelpful verdict: I just need more willpower. You likely won't remember every mechanism covered in this book by tomorrow, and that's fine. What's worth carrying forward is simpler than the details. The next time your attention scatters, resist the urge to treat it as evidence of some fixed personal failing. Ask instead what's actually happening beneath it. Is this a switching problem? A friction problem? A motivation problem? A fatigue problem? A stress response that's overstayed its welcome? The answer will be different on different days for different tasks in different seasons of your life. But the question itself, curious rather than punishing, is very often the first real step back toward the kind of sustained, quiet attention that all four of these people eventually found their way back to, not through force, but through understanding what their own minds actually needed. We've come to the end of this session. Please subscribe.